Good evening and welcome to TIFF Ballet Box. My name is Brad Dean. I'm the Senior Manager of Film Programs here. And I'd just like to start out by thanking some of our sponsors. Our lead sponsor, Bell, our major sponsors, RBC, Visa, and L'Oreal Paris. Our public supporters, the Government of Canada, the Government of Ontario, and the City of Toronto. I'd also like to thank our members and donors like you for supporting TIFF's charitable mission of bringing films to our screens 365 days a year. And I'd also like to thank and acknowledge our community partner on this series, the Tirgan Festival, for their generous support in helping us promote this series and getting the word out about it. If you've seen online or you've seen the guide, we have many guests upcoming in the series, so please refer back to that to see who else we have. It's a really great lineup. And I just wanted to remind you about a couple upcoming ones that are a little bit more immediate. Tomorrow night, Hamid Naficy, who's our guest today, will be back to introduce Shahid Salas's Still Life. So if you haven't seen this movie, I really recommend it. I think it's one of the great masterpieces in the history of Iranian cinema. And we'll be showing it on a really beautiful 35mm print we imported from France. So really don't miss this really rare opportunity. And also next weekend, we have one of the filmmakers in this series, Amir Naderi. Promises to be a really great weekend. He's going to introduce two of his own films, The Runner on Friday, and then on Saturday, he'll be introducing Water, Wind, Dust. And then after that, he'll be introducing another of Shahid Salas's films, A Simple Event. So I really encourage you to come out and see that. Naderi will be a lot of fun. So today, our guest is a professor of radio and television and film and the Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani Professor in Communication at Northwestern University. He's also an affiliate faculty appointment in the Department of Art History. He is a leading authority on cultural studies of diaspora, exile, and post-colonial cinemas, and he's also an expert on Iranian and Middle Eastern cinemas as well. He's published numerous works on these subjects, including his latest. I really encourage you, if you get a chance, for anyone with any interest in Iranian cinema. I mean, this is a really amazing four-volume book called Social History of Iranian Cinema. It's so detailed, so thorough, and just really, I mean, it's a really fun read too. But without further ado, please welcome Hamid Naficy.
Thank you so much, Brad, for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me. And thank you guys for coming here on this cold day. I came from Chicago, so the weather from here in Chicago are very, very similar. So I know how much it took to get out and come to see the film, and I think you're in for a beautiful treat. Today I want to sort of focus on the first 30-plus years of Iranian cinema from 1897 to the mid-1930s. Most people don't know Iranian cinema really began fairly early. Many of you have seen Iranian films before, and some of you have seen quite a number of them. But I think few people have seen the silent cinema of Iran. And in fact, only one silent feature film exists, and this is the one you're going to see tonight. So it's really a treat. Any work of history takes into account many theoretical, contextual, and historical considerations. One of these that I talk about today is the constitutive role that cinema and film industry played in Iranian modernity and modernization. I have done this work at length, and here is to plug my work. I've done this in 4 volumes in the age of 140 character text, Twitter. Writing a book that is 3,000 manuscript pages seems like a folly. And looking back at it, I sort of feel that way too. But it was also a privilege to do this. It took me over 37 years or so. It's like a third child. In fact, it's older than my 2 children. I've been with it for so many years. Volume 1 is the one that I'm going to sort of report to you from about the silent era cinema and the first Pahlavi Shah era. The second volume deals with the last Shah's period, where Iranian cinema really came to its own and produced a huge number of films. The third volume focuses on the few years of the revolution, where cinema, as well as society, was transformed completely and became a globalized cinema. So these are the 4 volumes that I deal with. Cinema as an agent of modernity is one of my overarching arguments. And the argument is that cinema facilitated modernity. It did this in many ways. And I'm going to count a few of them for you. It did this in what it showed, that is modern sites, modernization, and industrialization, as well as in the way it embodied mobility, speed, and sensory complexity. All of these were features of modernity. Some of these, in fact, you will see in the film that we're about to see. In addition, cinema brought in modernity in the industrial ways in which its films were manufactured, distributed, and exhibited for a mass public, in the way it catered to the tastes of diverse people through the development of genres and stars. It also helped consolidate a literal and an imagined nation through its representational practices. And finally, it helped individualization, an important component of modernity, by addressing each individual spectator personally through its realistic narratives and invisible film style, which encouraged spectator identification with the story and characters. I focus in this talk on the silent cinema during the last 3 decades of the Qajar dynasty and the first Pahlavi period, which lasted from 1925 to 41. Qajar-era cinema consisted primarily of the exhibition of foreign actualities. Actualities are the simple documentaries that were made early on. Documentaries and features, and the production of a limited number of domestic actualities, comic films, and dramas by pioneer exhibitors and producers. And I'll show you some examples of these early actualities and comic films. The image of women on the screen at the beginning was a problem, as was the presence of women in cinemas, in movie houses. And one of the first rules of censorship passed in Iran was about that issue. I'll discuss that also. In the US, the studio system adopted a highly industrialized method which paralleled the dominant production mode in the US. Basically, any film industry in any society follows the dominant mode of production in that society. In the US, the dominant mode of production was, in a modern production, was car manufacturing, the Fordist, Taylorist mode of production. And the studio system in the US was more or less based on this system. It was centralized. It was, there was division of labor in there. There was specialization of tasks, and there was hierarchization of management. And there was a variation of products in order to fit the taste of the public, the variety of cars that even each company produced. Each company produced a number of cars, in order to satisfy the needs and the aspirations of different members of society. And the studio system more or less followed the same way. There were divisions for sound, division for camera, division for special effects, division for various things. And each of these divisions had a head and had apprentices and other people involved in it. And there was a hierarchy. And it's amazing how the film industry followed the industrial production of cars. In Iran also, the dominant mode of production was the artisanal workshop phenomenon, what you would call kargah. in these kargah or workshops or ateliers, filmmakers were multifunctional jacks of all trades. The artisanal production mode I have theorized here, I think, for the first time. And one of these pioneers of cinema, Ovanes Ohanian, the filmmaker, the director who made the film today, Mr. Haji the Movie Actor, he was a jack of all trade. He was multifunctional, similar to the master craftsman of these workshops. He was a one-man band involved in filming, in editing, in importing, exporting, exhibiting, and sometimes even acting in the film. He himself appears in the film, Mr. Haji, as a film director. You'll see him. Before dealing with him, though, let me give you a bit of context to show the psychological, ideological, and power relationship between Iran and the West, because cinema, it was a very important representation of the West, and the contact of Iranians with cinema was very traumatic. Because Iranians did two kind of comparisons. On the one hand, they compared themselves historically to the glorious past of Iran, and they found themselves wanting. On the other hand, they compared themselves laterally with Europe and America of the day, and again, they found themselves profoundly inadequate. And you can see an example of this in Ebrahim Khan Sahafbashi Tehrani, the first Iranian film exhibitor, who in 1897 traveled to London to buy. He was an antique dealer. Like most of the pioneers, he was multifunctional, not only in cinema, but also in other aspects. So he was on a trip there, and he came to Canada. And in Canada, he wrote this in his diary, which is published, which shows the kind of anxiety and also the traumatic experience of traveling to Europe and to Canada and the US on this first film exhibitor. He says, "Today was the Sabbath for these people, and I went to their church. When I thought, well, I realized that everything they have, we have its opposite. For example, they have electric lights in their place of worship, and we have oil lamps in our mosques. Their metal instruments are always clean and shiny. Ours are dirty and rusted. They quietly listen in their churches while we talk and shout in ours. Their preachers talk in a language everyone can understand. Ours talk in such a dense Arabic language that they themselves cannot understand it. They pass the donation plate quietly and people drop money in it for a certain cause without anyone making a special appeal. We insist on donations for our own personal play and pleasure. They sit on velvet-covered benches. We sleep on dusty wicker mats. They attract people to the church with beautiful and varied songs. We sing only with reluctance. The differences are enormous. The only thing that we do better is washing our anus with water instead of with toilet paper." Right. If Iranians' actual contact with the West was traumatic, as this account shows, their virtual contact with it through the film viewing was alienating, despite the indigenizing efforts of filmmakers and exhibitors and the power of film to connect people across the world. Among filmmakers and exhibitors early on were Iranian emigres and ethno-religious minorities, Jews, Armenians, Baha'is, and Zoroastrians, as well as immigrants to Iran from other countries who gave Iranian cinema some of its specificity. One of these was that Iranian cinema was from the start not only inter-ethnic, but also transnational. minorities in Iran, the Armenians, the Jews, the Baha'is, and so forth, were multicultural, multilingual. They were businessmen. They had traveled abroad. They had contacts in various countries. They were very good at doing what cinema needed to do, which was to import and export and connect to the world. Women's images on the screen. Especially unveiled women, and their presence in movie houses posed a crisis, particularly for the religious strata, and women caused issues, as I will come to it. The first cinematographer here shown was the royal photographer to Muzaffareddin Shah Qajar, who ran the court photographic studio. His name, Ibrahim Khan Akkosbashi Sani al-Sultaneh. This shot was taken in Ostend, Belgium in 1900. It is Muzaffareddin Shah in 1900 made a trip, a long, I believe, 6 months trip to France for medical treatment, to go to mineral waters and those sort of things. And it was in Paris in 1900 that he attended the Universal Exposition in Paris, where cinema was a major was on major exhibition. The films were shown in a round hall. The screen was brought up by a winch from a hole in the ground all the way 90 feet up in the air, pulled up there. People sat on both sides of the screen, and they sprayed water on it so that it would become translucent and people could see the image from both sides. Muzaffareddin Shah describes in his diary what he saw, and at the end of this description, he says, I ordered Akkosbashi, the royal Akkosbashi, Ibrahim Khan, to buy the necessary equipment and films to bring home so that we could show it to our servants. And it is on the way out of Europe to Iran, they make a stop in Ostend, Belgium. And while in Belgium, Muzaffareddin Shah again has an entry in his diary in which he talks about a group of women today rode in front of us on carriages laden with flowers, and they threw these flowers at us, and we threw the flowers back at them. And the Akkosbashi, the royal photographer, was busy cinematographing. For 80 years, historians of cinema thought that he was being metaphorical here, that maybe a photographer was actually taking pictures, not motion pictures, until one of the researchers was Shahriar Adl was digging through the Golestan Palace archive, Akkas Khane, the old royal photography shop, and he came across a case that had reels of film that were deteriorating. And now we actually have that very film that Muzaffareddin Shah talked about, shot in 1900 by Akkosbashi. And this is the film. It shows some of the footage that he shot earlier, apparently in France. This is Muzaffareddin Shah sitting and looking directly at the camera. Bernard Shaw said that in one of his descriptions of cinema that the one-eyed demon seemed to mesmerize people. And here's the Shah again, completely mesmerized, looking directly at the camera, like a serpent. He calls it the one-eyed serpent. And as you can see, the filming is almost all of official visits of the king to various sites. Okay, I think this is the some of the sites of the Paris Exposition taken from the Seine. And soon we are coming to the women in Ostend. Looks like a garden party of some sort. Again, the direct look. And here's the photographer himself. And these are the women. These are the women in the carriages throwing flowers, and he in the center in the back throwing them back. He's so rigorous, and the women are, that this film is sometimes called the Battle of Flowers. Now, unlike in the US and in many European countries, cinema began as a public institution. Films were shown in movie houses, in open stores, and in fact, in the US, the cinema became an important source of assimilation for all the immigrants who were coming to the US. They learned how to become modern, how to be modern, how to eat with fork and knives and various other ways. And people paid to go to these cinemas. In Iran, because of this experience, because the king was involved in bringing the cinema to Iran, cinema began within the private sector, and not only within the private sector, but within the royal court situation. And it meant that the kind of footage that they shot was very different. Akosbashi, on the way when he came to Iran, he began to use his camera to record various scenes within the country. So I'm going to show you some of the early actualities and comic films and so forth that he shot. One of the most remarkable pictures that he shot is this one, the very first picture of women in public places. They're wearing their chador as well as their chakhchur, they're coming into the Ray train station. It's a train station that went from the pilgrimage town of Ray in south of Tehran to Tehran itself. This is the train coming in, and it has different compartments separated by gender. And you will see soon women rushing into their own compartment. Now, women, we're not sure whether women actually were aware that they were being filmed or not, but they're very free. Have no. And now this is an interesting. What you see here are the various comic films or actualities that were shot. These are the jesters of the court, and typically they had a tall guy and a little kutule, a little dwarf. And they played various games, and so you see some of those here. It shows the court's taste for comedy. Beating up the dwarf here. In this case, they're beating up. They're going to beat up the Arab, the other of Iranians. There's a gambling game going on here, right, at the table. Soon it breaks into a fight. And they pummel him as well. The political unconscious of Iranians is coming out in these films. Here's Muzaffar Shah himself recreating one of his hunting scenes on the porch of his palace. Trying to fly the This is an interesting thing. It looks like the photographer tells the king, this is a king walking towards the camera, Your Majesty, the shot didn't turn out okay. Can you go back and redo it? And here he goes back and he redoes it. So even documentary footage of those days is not trustable. Yeah. Okay. Now, a lot of, I have a whole chapter in volume 1 in which I talk about the dandies, or Fokoli. These were very important figure in Iranian modernity, and they were disdained tremendously and made fun of and all of that stuff. And there's a whole amount of literature, radio program, TV shows, and films about them. But some of the early filmmakers themselves were dandies. You know where the word Fokol comes from? This. False color. Has nothing to do with hair or anything else that we traditionally think of. This is Mirza Ibrahim Khan. This is Ardash Esbat Mangerian. You know, they were quite dandified people. And they came into conflict with the society at large, with intellectuals and so forth. Jafar Khane az Farang Omade, that was a famous play that was that played on this whole thing. Okay. Now, let me just get quickly so that I won't be. Ibrahim Khan Sahaf Bashi, the guy who was in London and who was in Canada and who talked about the quotation that I read from you, when he came back to Iran, he established the first commercial cinema, not related to the court, commercial cinema in the back of his antique shop. But his cinema didn't last more than a month because at one point the major Ayatollah of the time, Sheikh Fazlullah Nuri, had heard that he was showing movies of that contained women without hijab, without scarf or any covering, and so Sheikh Fazlullah issued a fatwa against the cinema, and the Shah proceeded to shut down the cinema. So for the first, this is the first sort of example that we have of film censorship based on the women veiling. It is also possible that the Shah actually closed down the shop because Ibrahim Khan was a pro-constitutional activist, and he wanted a democratic parliamentarian government to come into power. And he actively sought to do, and in my book I talk about some of his activism there. And maybe the Shah shut down his place, not necessarily only because of the unveiled women's images, but because he was also a rabble-rouser. All right, so Reza Shah came to power in 1925. The Qajar were dismantled, and it is and Reza Shah put into place a kind of a syncretic westernization program that attempted to modernize and secularize the multicultural, multilingual, multi-ethnic Iranians into a homogeneous modern nation. It is during his time that he decreed that Iran in foreign languages should be called Iran and not Persia anymore, because Persia implied an old, ancient, decrepit society, while Iran was becoming modern. And it was in this context that Ohanian produced his film. Ovanes Ohanian, or Oganians. He was a Russian Armenian born in Ashgabat, Turkmenistan. He was apparently trained at the Cinema Academy of Moscow and had made a few films in Ashgabat. Unable to find work in the Soviet Union, however, he emigrated to Iran in 1929, where within a year he audaciously produced the first silent film in Iran when he barely could speak Persian. There are contradictory reports by him and others about his true place of birth. Some say he was born in Mashhad, Iran. About his date of birth, some give his date of birth as 1901. about his name, about his genealogy, nationality, film training, and purported doctoral degree. Once he claimed he had a doctorate in medicine. Another time, he had a doctorate in film studies. Ohanian provides an intriguing case study of the type of expedient cultural hybridity and self-fashioning strategies in which westernized film pioneers engaged. What we know for sure is that with ceaseless effort, Ohanian created Tehran's first film studio, established Iran's first film acting school, and made not only newsreels for the government, but also the first silent feature film. He worked systematically. He trained himself and others' talent by establishing the Film Acting Training Center in May 1930 with financial assistance from a Russian emigre who owned Cinema Mayak. Around 150 students applied. 12 of them, all men, completed the first cycle of instruction, which included classes in acting, photography, filmmaking, gymnastics, boxing, fencing, ballet, Eastern and European dancing, and swimming. All of these were necessary for silent film acting. The curriculum was likely influenced by the Soviet film system, which Ohanian had observed. Ohanian and his first batch of students produced several short nonfiction and fiction movies as part of their training, which they exhibited to an excited, invited audience of civic leaders, parliamentarians, and journalists. These included films about the lives of 3 poor people who were on the verge of death due to hunger, about a jailbreak, about a robbery, about a comic and illiterate dentist at work in his office, and various performance films of sports and demonstrations of physical prowess. Some of these actually worked themselves into the Mr. Haji the Movie Actor, so you actually will recognize something like that dentist guy is part of this film. In the same year, in 1930, Ohanian established his Pers Film Studio. Just notice the name Pers Film Studios. He harks back to the name Persia. And with the help from his student actors, he wrote, acted in, directed, and edited the first silent fiction movie in Iran, Abi and Rabi, which the veteran newsreel cameraman Motazedi filmed. Unfortunately, no copy of this slapstick comedy starring a tall, thin, and a fat, short guy exists, because it burned in a fire in Cinema Mayak in 1932. Nevertheless, Abi and Rabi generated good income, in fact, 12 times the cost of the negative, as well as good reviews, energizing Ohanian to continue movie production. An earnest institution builder, he created the International Institute of Motion Picture of Asia, which offered honorary doctorates to applicants who paid their fees, purportedly recruiting noted figures to serve on its board, including the writer and historian Hamid Naficy, my dad's uncle, a member of the Society for National Heritage, and the journalist and publisher of Etela'at magazine, Abbas-Gholi. He also created the International Federation of Scientific Societies, a bogus organization whose ideology was absolute cosmopolitanism without regard to nationality, religion, politics, social caste, and belief. Amazing, the stories of the pioneers of cinema in Iran, also elsewhere, is full of, I mean, many of them were charlatans and operators and just creative geniuses, really, however morally suspect they might be. The following year, in 1931, Ohanian offered the second term of his film school, in which Naficy taught a history of costume, and from which 18 more students graduated. He tried to bring in women, but unsuccessfully. The filming of Mr. Haji the Movie Actor was undertaken under highly artisanal and capitalist conditions. Just imagine, Ohanian sold 40 shares to investors, each worth 52 months. He engaged in the first instance of product placement by prominently displaying the film posters and marquee of the Luna Park Cinema, in which one of the last sequences of the film was shot. He also showcased the storefront of Omega watch dealer, accompanied by a line from Haji that endorses the watch, for which Ohanian apparently received money from the dealer. In an utterly 21st century move, the watch was incorporated into the film's plot. HAJI AGHA doesn't want to be filmed, and they concoct a story by stealing his watch and forcing him to go through town trying to find his watch. And that's the film. But the watch is an Omega watch, and it's a product placement. It's ingenious. Ohanian faced technical difficulties, but his ingenuity triumphed. His cinematographer was George Pavlov Potemkin, a white Russian emigre. The camera he used was at least 20 years old, with 3 lenses, only one of which worked. It was hand-cranked, a deficiency that was overcome when one of Ohanian's students, a tailor, attached a hand-cranked sewing machine to the camera to obtain a smoother movement. These guys were really, impressive. At the time, it took up to 18 months to import negative film stock from Europe through the port of Khorramshahr, often under damaging conditions. Ohanians and Potemkin resorted to using a mixture of negative and positive stock, resulting in uneven contrast. One of the reasons that the film tonight is a little bit uneven in its contrast is because of this variation in negative and positive film stock they used. Finally, filming was sometimes interrupted because of a lack of funds, raw stock, or proper equipment, forcing Perth Film Studio to pick up newsreel work for the government to finance the feature project, which took more than 1.5 years to complete. Mr. Haji the Movie Actor is technically sophisticated and delightful comedy that, can you imagine, the first feature film that we have made in Iran is about 2 important things. First is it's about cinema. So don't think that Kiarostami and the rest of the gang since the 1980s and 90s have introduced this self-reflexivity film about filmmaking. This film is entirely about filmmaking. And the other thing that this film is about the contrast between tradition and modernity. The film is about this Haji, the guy who's gone to Mecca. He's religious, and he has a daughter who wants to marry a young, I have 5 minutes, who wants to marry a fiancée, but both of them want to become actors. And the Haji doesn't like that. Morally, he objects to cinema. So they concoct this story of stealing his watch, and while he's going around the town looking for his watch, they film him. At the end of the film, they goad him to come to the movie house to watch his film. And once he sees himself on the screen, he suddenly changes around. He becomes modern. And he says, no problem, you can marry and you can become actors, and you can have 11, I hope you have 11 children or 12 children, and all of them become actors. So that's the story. So the traumatic experience of watching movies or going abroad is really now ameliorated by film representation. And I think that's an important fact. So let me show you a little bit of this film. You're going to see the whole thing, but I'm going to show you just the setup of the film. It's first of all in 3 languages. The intertitles of the film. It shows, again, the multiculturalism of society, French, Russian, and Persian. And I think for this occasion, they have added an English subtitle. So this film is in 4 languages. It is a film that was made, it's in 8 reels. Drama, comedy, it's categorized as that. assistant director. The director is Ovanes Ohanian. The assistant directors are there. The photographer, it says Rembrandt. Lists the actors and their positions. His own daughter is acting in the film. His own daughter appears without the veil, and this is before Reza Shah's forced unveiling. So it shows that cinema actually preceded some of the modernization of Reza Shah's rule. And you see, it shows the city. It begins with the city, the modernization of the city of Tehran, all the cars lined up. People are beginning to wear the Reza Shah's Pahlavi outfits. Meidun Tufkhune. It's a famous square. Watch this now. Looking at his watch and cut to the clock there. This is his in-law, Haji's in-law. And the next shot shows the director who's looking for his next topic underneath a mount of paperwork, his script. And who is this guy? This is Ohanian himself. He's thinking about his next story. What can I do? Where's my heart? Here? No, there. All right, time is up. You're going to see the real film. So, but shoot, I want to read you something. Can I have one more minute? Please, please. Pretty please. Okay, here. Because I think it's important to think a little bit about the spectatorial situation in those days. In the silent period, movies were silent, but movie houses were not silent. They were very noisy and very smelly. Okay, sorry, but here is you have gender segregation. Women are on this side and men are over there. There are 3 fights going on, one on the poster here, one in the audience, and one on the screen. These are the musicians playing live music behind the screen. This guy's brought his goat here. This lady has brought his little baby who's peeing right there. This lady's got something cooking here, and this is the lady who says, little sister, Abji, after you finish with the peeing, can you stir the pot? So there was a lot of activities, noise, and things like that going on there. Lots of fights, talkbacks, and so forth. And food was not the only source of smell, since at times filmgoers and their impatient children who did not want to miss the movie urinated on the floor instead of leaving the hall for the restroom. Shusha Gapi, an Iranian who lived in the UK, she relates a possibly apocryphal story illustrative of the kind of haggling in which theater managers and spectators engaged in the silent era. And this is a quotation from her. He says, in desperation, the management projected a plea on the screen before each showing, and this is what it said. It said, gentlemen are requested to kindly refrain from relieving themselves inside the cinema. Or it simply said, please do not urinate here, but use the lavatories outside. When polite language failed to produce the expected result, harsher words were used. God's curse on the son of a whore who pisses in this cinema. Or whoever pisses in this place is the son and brother and husband of whores. He himself is a bugger. No good. Finally, it was thought that the image would succeed where words had proved ineffectual. A drawing of a huge equine penis was projected on the screen with this caption: "This will bugger any son of a whore who dares to piss here, and will then take care of his wife, his mother, and his sister." The audience just laughed and turned the insult back onto the management by drawing similar niceties on the walls of the cinema. Eventually, a solution was found. A little ditch was dug all around the auditorium, which carried away any liquid from the floor to the sewer. It would take years for movie exhibitors to train pre-modern audiences used to the collective, unruly, and noisy mode of social and oral entertainment to learn the new modern habits of silent, respectful, individualized viewing. Thank you very much.